Zone 2 training is a lie, at least the way that 99% of cyclists are doing it and implementing it. I've spent the last 12 months tracking down 5 of the world's best cycling coaches, the ones behind Grand Tour wins, World Championship wins, Olympic medals, and every single one of them told me the exact same thing. You're probably riding 50% too hard when you think you're riding easy. Here's what nobody tells you about pro cyclists. They spend about 80% of their time riding at a pace so slow that recreational riders will be able to ride with them. Maybe some recreational riders will be able to ride past them on the bike path. We're talking conversations without breathing hard, slow. And yet this embarrassingly easy riding is precisely what separates World Tour riders from talented amateurs who plateau year after year. In this episode, I'm revealing the Zone 2 secrets from the best coaches in the world. Dan Lorang and John Wakefield at Bora Red Bull, Vasilis Anastopoulos at Astana, Dr. Christian Schrot from Jaco Alua, and the one and only Professor Stephen Seiler. And here's the counterintuitive truth that all these coaches try to drum into me time after time. The slower you're willing to go today, the faster you'll be able to go when it counts. So if you've ever felt guilty for not training hard enough or wondering why your FTP isn't improving despite all those threshold intervals, this is your wake-up call and maybe your permission slip to finally train like the pros actually train, not how you think they train. Let's jump into this.
I think a lot of time-crunched athletes fall into the same trap and they create one sacrificial lamb because it takes up the most time. And that's typically endurance riding, Zone 2 riding, because by its very nature, it needs to be done for extended periods of time. You mentioned athletes kind of optimizing around their environment. Is there a case to be made for in the winter we can substitute some of our endurance riding for cross-country skiing, or when we get into the summer season, can we substitute it for walking if we're time crunched? Does it have the same physiological adaptations?
100%. So I think that is a big benefit what amateurs athletes have, that they can really build their base with different sports. Basically, it's about moving. Let's take heart rate. Basically, we want to have physical adaptation, and we want to have a certain amount of time in a certain amount of training zone. And there, sometimes it doesn't matter if you do it a VO2 max interval now by running, by cross-country skiing, or on the bike, because we want an unspecific adaptation at that moment. We want to increase your general VO2 max. For sure, if you're doing on the bike, the expert will say it's a little bit different because you are using the muscles that you are really using during the biking. But in the winter, this is not so important. It's more important that you can do it and that you can also choose between different training methods or different training disciplines. And it's also good for the head. So it makes fun. And also it develops your skills in a larger way, what is quite good also for amateur athletes and more sustainable in the winter with bad weather, with long working times and so on. So I'm a big fan of that.
How do you think about measuring the adaptation for it? If I go for a 3-hour bike ride, we would normally think, around 30 training stress points per hour for a Zone 2 ride. If I went for a 3-hour walk, should I attribute the same training stress score to it? Is there a linear relationship?
I think training stress score is probably hard to take that one. I would more go on a heart rate. So basically to say, okay, how much time, let me say your aerobic endurance heart rate is between 120 and 140. And then to say how much time did I spend now in that zone by doing the sport that I did. Probably on the bike, it will be 120 to 130. Probably when you run, it's 130 to 140. But that you spend enough time in that training zone. One trap where you can fall in is with running, because running is quite demanding for your bones, for your tendons. So if somebody says, I have a 2-hour ride on my program, and he's now replacing it by a 2-hour run, it's something completely different for the muscles, for the bones. And there sometimes also the injury are happening because the athlete says, hey, cool, I go outside, it's cold, but running is always good. So there I don't get cold. And then he starts running, and after 1.5 hours, everything is just hurting. Probably knee pain starts. So running is a discipline, or every sport where you have an impact are disciplines that you have to build up step by step. Not because you cannot do it from the cardiovascular system, but just because your your bones, tendons, and so on are not ready for it. So you have to build it up step by step. That's not the case with cross trainer, with cross country skiing, with there's some sports where you don't have this impact.
Yeah, I'm kind of guilty of introducing that term to the entire scientific literature, or at least placing it in that context way back in 2004, so 20 years ago. And I've been trying to figure it out ever since. But back then, the initial data that we collected, it was from rowers, it was from cyclists and runners, rowers, cross-country skiers, and runners. And we saw this in the data that they were either running or rowing very easily at low powers, low paces, just aerobic endurance, or they were doing fairly high intensity, often interval-based work. This is what the rowers were doing. They weren't doing threshold workouts. Cross-country skiers, they were doing very disciplined kind of polarization of their training. And so that's the term that was used. But if you take that term to, if you say, well, the ultimate polarization would be to just basically be sitting on the couch or throwing up, then the term can be misunderstood and misused. And there has been a lot of discussion around that. But now I would say 20 years on, what I think athletes have learned how to do with their coaches over decades is they're polarizing the stress of the training. So they are doing a lot of their training, I would say, under the stress radar at fairly low intensities for them, but they're using duration. They're saying, hey, I will do 4 hours at a low intensity to build mitochondria because that doesn't create a big stress response in my body as opposed to doing intervals every day. And so that seems to be the key feature of polarized training is about 80% of the training is in that proverbial green zone. The athletes are talking to each other, they're doing the work, and maybe they'll have a coffee in the middle of a 6-hour ride, but then some of the days are really tough, and so they're doing both, but they're balancing it in a way that is sustainable.
So polarized training to me is a training philosophy. And I wonder, when you apply a training philosophy to very diverse goals, does the same training philosophy work regardless of if I'm targeting a 60-minute criterium, I want to be national criterium champion, or if I'm targeting a 350-kilometer ultra endurance race? Really what I'm getting at is, how important is it to calibrate what we're optimizing for?
Well, I would say it's really not a philosophy, but it's more of a self-organizing principle. That is that what are the constraints for us as athletes? If we want to be successful in our endurance endeavors, whether it's as a criterium racer or as a GC candidate or as an ultra rider, we have to find a sustainable way. I know that's a tired word, but we have to have a methodology that we stay healthy doing. Because if we're not staying healthy, if we're not recovering on average from day to day, if we're not able to train for months and even years in this endeavor, then the methodology is not appropriate. And so I think that is what we've seen, is that I didn't invent polarized training, but what I saw is that athlete populations from diverse sports that really weren't talking to each other or independent of each other finding the same solution to a problem, to a biological challenge, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I had Dr. David Lippman on the podcast. You might have come across some of his work in the area of human physiology as well. And he advocated something very similar, and he had a nice phrase. He said, if you zoom out and look at an athlete's macro cycle, be it annual training year or multi-training year, success outcomes are less defined by the athlete's ceiling and more defined by the athlete's floor. So how good is our worst week is much more important than how good is our best week.
Yeah, and I've in some presentations internationally, I've just had PowerPoint slide with a number on it, like 532. And I said, okay, this is a pretty important number. What is it? They're like, is it the watts for 5 minutes, or
That's
is
a big
it the,
watts.
I said, no. Yeah, that would be pretty darn good. No, I said, no, that's the number of sessions that athlete successfully achieved in that year.
Ooh.
Let's say it was a triathlete. And my number might be 315. A cyclist might be 400. A triathlete might be 600 workouts. A hobby, a recreational cyclist, it might be 150. But depending on my goals, that's one of the success criteria is, am I able to be consistent? Have I been able to stay healthy, avoid injury, and string together a long sequence of workouts that were executed basically after my intention? And what we find is when athletes stand on the podium and you ask them, well, what's your secret? They'll say, well, my secret is I don't have a secret. My secret is that I get the work done. I was fortunate enough to have a 6-month period where I was able to train very consistently without injury or illness, and good things happened for me. That's often the story. That's kind of boring, but that's the floor, is being able to achieve that, I would say.
Let's hone in and talk about the amateur. I'll define him as a time-crunched athlete, because I think most amateurs will identify with, we've conflicting demands on our time. We don't get to get out of bed and just ride our bike for the day. And if we have the 3 levers which you can pull, intensity, duration, and frequency, what order should we be pulling these levers across the training week to build this training plan for athletes?
I guess I'll just repeat the story that's become kind of typical. As I say, look, let's start with just somebody that's trying to go from basically not training to doing a sustainable session, and they can maybe do a 40K on the bike, and feel good about it, or it could be a 10K run. So I'm going to begin with frequency. I'm going to say, look, my first goal with you is to establish a habit. I may not say that to them directly, but I'm going to say, all right, for the next 6 weeks, all I care about is you get out the door a certain number of times a week. Now, let's agree on how many that is. And they're going to say, well, given that I'm the coach of the football team and I've got this and this and this, let's go for 3 days a week. I'm going to commit to that. Perfect. All right. So we're going to commit to that frequency, but now do it. Get out the door 3 times a week. You're going to get challenged by it because you've got other stuff going on, but make that a priority, and let's talk and keep in touch. And so 6 weeks later, we get feedback and talk about it with each other. Say, yeah, I'm doing it. In fact, I'm not only doing it, but it's feeling like a habit, and I'm missing it the 1 or 2 times I haven't been able to get out the door. And I say, awesome. Now we got frequency going, and we kind of got a habit going. We've got a, it in the brain, exercise is a habit. So then I said, what have you been doing? Because I haven't asked them that before. All right. I haven't asked about how hard or how long. I said, all right, how long, what's your typical workout? I'm getting out and I'm doing walk, run for 30 minutes, or I'm able to ride for a half an hour, maybe 40 minutes, but that's about it. It's been quick. Okay. Now I want you to try to at least one of those days to start with, let's stretch. It's still 3 days a week, but now we're going to start using duration, that second lever you talked about, because duration is a powerful lever from a biological point of view. There's a huge difference between 30 minutes and an hour and 90 minutes. It matters. So we can use that to our advantage, but that does add some time. So I say, all right, let's try to stretch one of those workouts. Now, if we're talking cycling, then we might try to stretch it to, say, a 90-minute ride over the next 6 weeks, okay? That's doable. In running, we'd probably say 60 minutes as a goal, initially. So now we're using that, and we're going to use another 6 weeks to slowly build that out. We're not going to do anything in a hurry, because that's another thing that people do wrong, is they get enthusiastic, but then they go out too hard and they get hurt.
Yeah.
Or they have a really bad experience where they realize, man, I'm not in shape. No, you're not, because you haven't been doing very much. But it gets better. So we give them some time. So now we're 12 weeks in. What's 12 weeks? That's 3 months. And now we've got 2 levers working for us. And now, after 12 weeks, now I'm going to introduce that magic buzzword, intervals and intensity, but not before. And I think that's one of the most common mistakes that's made, is that we flip that. Of those 3 levers, what is the order that we use? We go out hard, so we use the intensity lever almost from day one, and then we get hit in the face with it. So after I've established some frequency and I've got them able to stretch and they're comfortable doing a 90-minute ride at a very aerobic pace and being able to talk to their friends, now I'm going to say, you know what? I know there's a hill on that favorite route you have. Let's introduce carefully some repeats up that hill, some interval training to try to push your heart rate up kind of maybe towards 90% and try to collect some minutes or accumulate some minutes doing that. So we're going to do it several times, but we're going to progress it carefully, okay? So that's that third lever. So in my head, and that's exactly what we see with elite performers, is what do? They're very good on frequency. They're consistent. They're getting out the door. It's every day. And then they are doing a lot of duration. I was just looking at some workouts from, World Tour teams today, and 8-hour rides. I'm looking at their power files. This is part of their day. This is what they're doing in January and February, preparing for the tour, for the Grand Tours. I'm looking at Grand Tour candidates, and they're doing the 8-hour rides, but they're not going hard every day. In fact, if I look at in isolation at the power output for that 8-hour ride, I say, well, you know what? I think I could do that, but not for 8 hours. You with me?
So if you take someone that has
they're using duration.
Someone that has a use case B, we'll call it, somebody that actually kind of like myself. So I used to view performance and cycling through how good can I be at cycling, period. Everything else in my life came second to cycling. And now I have to view cycling through a new lens. I have to view cycling through how good can I be at cycling in this time-bound container each week. So I have maybe 10 hours per week to ride my bike.
Yeah.
So my new challenge is, how do I optimize that 10 hours?
Right.
And what I see more and more athletes doing is pulling the intensity lever over and over again to ramp TSS higher and higher in that 10-hour week. So they're saying to themselves, hey, I can achieve the same TSS in a 10-hour week with piles of intensity that I used to achieve in a 15-hour week with a lot less intensity. Talk to me about what I'm assuming is a flawed logic in this thinking.
Yeah, unfortunately, it is a flawed logic, and partly it's a little bit driven by some bad metrics. TSS developed by Training Peaks, and all power to them. And I know Dirk Friel, a great guy, but it says it stands for Training Stress Score. Well, stress is not what's being measured at all. It's measuring load. It's just measuring a calibrated load. And so let's say you do a 4-hour ride at some reasonable power output that's well below your first threshold, your first lactate turd point. So it's doable. The first hour feels easy. But is the 4th hour in that ride, let's assume you're pretty serious and you do a 4-hour ride on the weekend. Is the 4th hour at 210 watts or whatever you're holding, is that the same as the first hour? Does it feel the same? Is your heart rate the same? Is your perception of exertion the same? I'm pretty sure the answer is going to be no, unless you're it's definitely not for me, but if, maybe for Wout van Aert it is, but it's not for most of us. So that means that the stress of achieving that power for that first hour, second hour, third hour, fourth hour, they're very different.
Okay, that's
really
not
accounted for.
So they've interpreted it as a linear relationship between effort and stress, and it's not.
And it's totally wrong. No physiologist anywhere would ever agree that that's how that works. So what they have is a load score, which is great. That's great. But then we need to say, well, yeah, but now what's the stress associated with achieving it? Because that's what we're trying to manage, right? Because if it gets too stressful, if the interval session gets too hard, we dig too deep, then it's going to take even longer to recover from, which is going to impact our subsequent workout.
Because I often
so
wonder
we're trying
that,
to manage it.
Sorry to cut across, Justine. I often wonder that, because if you take that example, so that's I'm doing roughly, if I'm training 390 to 400 watts for 20 minutes. So I'm going out at a 210 to 220 watt endurance ride. Like you said, that number was pretty accurate. And in hour 1, I might have 110 to 115 beats for that power output. But in hour 4 or hour 5, I'll have this cardiac drift where I'm maybe 130, 135 beats at the same power output.
Yep.
I often wondered, is heart rate TSS a better approximation of that effort than actual power TSS?
Well, it would definitely be more consistent with the concept of stress, for sure. So if you were going to try to really separate and say, here's what I do, that's just the external load, here's what it costs me to do, based on heart rate or lactate or perceived exertion. You can also use perceptual measurements, but that's that triangle that we often talk about in training monitoring is external load and then physiology and then some perception, some how does it feel? And so that's what we're really interested in looking at is what's the relationship between how hard I'm having to dig physiologically and then what I'm actually doing, both during a workout, but then across days and weeks and months and so forth. So that's really what it comes down to. And then part of you optimizing for you is knowing when to pull the plug on a workout, when to say, you know what, 4 hours is enough today. Because I've got 20 beats of heart rate drift. I'm feeling really empty. I can do another hour, but I'm basically just going to be surviving it. And I don't think the cost to benefit is going to be in my favor. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do we get a different physiological response? So obviously we're all familiar with zones, and then in each of those zones we get an associated physiological adaptation. When we start having that cardiac drift.
Well, I'm going to time out. It's not that simple. That's one of the biggest mistakes that people make is they think, oh, I've got to be in zone 3 to get the zone 3 adaptations. I've got to be in zone 1 to get the zone 1 adaptations. There's a tremendous amount of overlap in the biological signaling. And this is what we've learned from lots of research in the lab, and that it's not so simple. And the muscle fibers are not like calculating which zone you're in, right? They don't really care about your training program to that extent. They're responding to, either I'm being asked to contract on this duty cycle or I'm not, and there are signals associated with that. So let's take that 5-hour workout where you've got a lot of cardiac drift. Essentially, you started in your green zone, but you may be, in essence, at threshold level by the end of that workout, even though your power hasn't changed a watt. Does that make sense?
And are you getting a threshold adaptation then?
Well, what you are doing, why is heart rate going up? Why is it drifting, as we call it? Why is cardiac drift happening? Let's make the assumption that you're very good at drinking, you're putting water on board, you're getting some carbs, so you're doing that part of your job of fueling and drinking appropriately. Let's assume the temperature is, you're in the UK, so it's not super hot. So those things are okay. But yet you still show cardiac drift. Why? That's because your brain is having to recruit more muscle because you're starting to fatigue. Our muscles are kind of organized in so-called units. It's like little brigades of fibers, and they can be recruited. As some fatigue, the brain calls in reinforcements.
Okay.
So it is costing your body more and more to achieve a given power due to various fatigue and damage processes in the body. So the brain is bringing in those reinforcements, and then it's in parallel turning up heart rate. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that cardiac drift is kind of an indicator of the reality that you're not in a steady state. There's no such thing as a steady state in the human body. If you go long enough, you wear out, you fatigue. And so your 4-hour, 5-hour ride is an example where, yeah, it feels great the first 2 hours, but it does start feeling, it's a different kind of fatigue than that interval session. It's an empty. You're going empty. Whereas in that interval session, you feel like you're filling up with poison, right? It's a different perceptual feeling, but they're both associated with the fact that you are fatiguing and you are calling in every reinforcement you can to try to mobilize and achieve the power that's expected.
How do we measure the cost of that effort? So if the effort is the watts that we're putting out, heart rate maybe is an approximation of the cost of the effort. Is there a more effective way to measure the cost of that effort?
Well, it's a really interesting question. And one of the things that we've started doing, and it's still early days, but thanks to technology, we're starting to measure ventilation also out in the field. And it turns out that, and you know this from cycling, you can hear how hard someone's working just listening to them breathe.
Well,
right?
If you're in the break, that's one of the things you'll watch for. Like, I'll watch for if I'm in the break with someone, I'm like, okay, I want to figure out the best place to attack here. Obviously, you've your little tricks of, we reference like 90-degree turns, and if you can get somebody on the wrong side of someone else's wheel, maybe you'll get a couple of bike lengths advantage. But you're also looking biomechanically, are they starting to recruit more from the hips and their shoulders are starting to wag? But breathing is another thing you'll kind of tune into and go, okay, he's breathing has changed patterns.
Are they breathing out their ears? And if I'm breathing hard, I'm going to try to hide that, right? Because I don't want to expose my weakness. So breathing is a truth teller, and it turns out physiologically it also really is, because we've done quite a lot of field work to try to look at hard sessions where we're measuring both that heart rate drift, but we're also measuring the ventilation drift, because the same thing we're seeing with breathing frequency is it goes up, but it goes up at a steeper rate. So it's even more sensitive to fatigue. And it's a really interesting thing, because when those athletes are in that really high breath frequency zone, they're cooked, even if heart rate's not that high. Heart rate may only be 85, 90% of max. And you say, they should be able to do more. But their breathing is telling us that no, they're cooked. They're empty. And so that's, we're starting to get at it, is this idea of how do we measure that stress during the workout and maybe make informed decisions about how deep to dig. Does that make sense?
That's brilliant. So to circle back to the 10-hour-a-week athlete, are you advocating, my understanding of Polarized has been an 80-20 distribution of easy to hard. Is that the sort of distribution we're looking at?
It's a good starting point for sure. I'm not going to argue and say that everybody's going to be exactly the same. You may have some people that recover better, and also age comes into play. I think as we get older, recovery ability does tend to decline. So the athlete, the 25-year version of me that could handle 2, really tough sessions a week and just bury myself, maybe now I do well with just the one, for example, at close to 60. So those kinds of issues, there's individualization issues, but that 80-20, at least 2-3 out of every 4 days, on average, 3 out of every 4 days are going to be just basically aerobic days without a huge high intensity. That's a good starting point. And then you make fine adjustments as a function of your individual abilities, where you are in the season, and so forth. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do we have methods or tools for measuring progress if somebody is on a periodized training model? Like, what's our signals of progress that we know we're responding to this, or we know maybe we need to pull a little bit more at the intensity lever?
Well, I think what we see with elite performers is, like you were saying, it's the floor that's the most important. That first, in physiology language, we call it the first lactate turn point, where that first break point where power output, you're increasing it, and lactate is staying low. You're under control. It's easy. But then you get this little first break. That point in elite performers is they are at really high power outputs. They're at really high relative capacity. It could easily be, well, in some of our elite riders, it may be 350 watts at what we call LT1. Tim de Klerk, who's we call him the tractor
beast.
He can ride. He's ridden for 5 hours at 350. I talked to him last year. We had an interview, and he says he did a breakaway in the Tour de France this year, I believe, or was it the Tour de France, or was it another? But he got in a break, and he almost never is allowed to do that. But he said, "Yeah, I had a really good day. I was 5 hours at 350 watts." So that's just him. He says, "Look, I don't have that upper end. That's why I do what I do. I'm the tractor, but my lower end is pretty darn good." And that's what we see with all these elite performers, is their lower end kind of first threshold is high, and enviably high, and then they take it from there upwards.
You're looking for improvements in that LT1, but if somebody is if we're to sound the warning signs on a training plan isn't working well, we're using a reversed periodized method, and maybe the distribution of the three levers we referenced, we haven't got this right. What's the warning signs look like that we maybe need to reevaluate our training plan?
One of the there are several, of course, and one of the things you need to trust is if you don't feel like training, that's a problem. Because if you're motivated and normally enjoy training, but your brain is saying, "Man, I just can't hardly get myself off the couch," then that is something you should be taking seriously as one of your first indicators. It's the canary in the coal mine, as they used to say. But we also see, if you need some hardcore physiology, we see often that heart rate is actually too low for a given power output. It's suddenly, it's 10 beats too low, and you think, well, that isn't that good. That means, I've had a nice response. No, because it's not good if your max heart rate is also lower.
Yeah.
Meaning you've got depression of the entire autonomic nervous system. The brakes are on. That is a very telltale sign that we'll listen to athletes and they'll say, I can't get my heart rate up.
What do the Giro d'Italia, Stage Slayer, Mads Pedersen and half the professional peloton have in common? Well, they're all turning to Nomio, the natural performance enhancer proven to reduce lactate buildup during intense efforts. In the 2025 Giro d'Italia, Pedersen's form was undeniable. The Danish star surged to 4-stage victories. This was a major leap in form from his previous season, and a key part of this preparation and performance was Nomio. Developed by the same researchers who discovered the performance power of dietary nitrate. Those beetroot shots that half the peloton were using? Nomio is clinically proven to lower lactate levels, reduce oxidative stress, improve training adaptations, and deliver a noticeable boost from the very first time you take it. Riders are reporting bigger threshold power, fresher legs mid-race, and quicker recovery, all from a formula made with just 3 natural ingredients: broccoli sprouts, lemon, and sugar. Whether you're racing at the front or you're smashing local segments, Nomio helps you get more out of every ride. Take it before key sessions or races for an immediate edge, or take your training to the next level and get more out of your hard work. Go to drinknomio.com, that's NOMIO, and check out this game-changing supplement. Details are in the episode show notes or description down below.
So when you look at long rides, are you predominantly zone 1, zone 2, and then as a follow-up to that, how do you know when enough endurance is enough? Are you looking at like LT1, LT2, or when they're moving a certain amount right, you're thinking, okay, we have endurance boxed off, now we can start to layer on intensity? Or what's your protocol for considering how much endurance to do and when to stop it?
Yes, I'm focusing on the time that we spend on LT1 during the endurance rides. And then I can see, so always the target when you do such long rides is to improve a little bit to move your LT1 close to the LT2, and then move the LT2 go close to your VO2 max. It's the optimal goal for each coach. So this is how I define if the 6-hour ride or the 7-hour ride had the desired effect to the rider. And of course, it's different when we're talking about for sprinters or for climbers, GC riders. It's a completely different approach, of course.
And so what's the intensity level they're spending time out on those long endurance rides? Because I've seen some coaches even putting zone 1 rides in.
Yeah, most of the rides, it's upper zone 1. And they would do most of the climbs around 4 threshold, just below 4 threshold. No more than that. This is all about the long rides. I prescribe these long, easy endurance rides. I want the riders to finish those long rides tired but not exhausted. This is how I describe them. I always tell them I want to finish tired but not completely spent. That's not the target of this session.
So when they're getting up the next day, are they carrying residual fatigue from that ride, or they feel like they could do the same ride again?
They can feel like they can do the same ride again. I think that's the key on the success.
And do you look at data like heart rate variability, anything like that, to determine their readiness to do the next day's training session?
Yeah, I would take, HRV, resting heart rate, urine color, the weight, all this data next morning to see if they are recovered from the rides or not. Because also we're talking about specific blocks of training. It's not only about one training. Usually we do 3-4 day blocks or 2-day blocks. And then you have to be able to manipulate these sessions and to combine them. So at the end of the day, you have the total idea, the total picture after how the rider looks like after 2-3 days of work. If he needs 1 day of recovery, if he needs 2 days of recovery, it's up to the coach to determine, based on his experience, what is the response of the rider. Because nowadays we have a lot of data, we have a lot of, as I said, a lot of metrics. But at the end of the day, the question that we do to the rider, how do you feel, is the most accurate one.
Yeah. I think that's like a pendulum, because when I started, and I was reading books like Joe Friel's Training Bible, that was all they talked about. How do you feel? Do a morning score. What's your fatigue from 1 to 5? What's your motivation to train from 1 to 5? Your level of sickness. And then from that, you decide if you're going to train or not. But in the next 10, 15 years, we've seen this massive trend towards data. But I kind of view it like a pendulum. And it feels to me like the pendulum's back swinging a little bit away from data and going back to the rider. How do you feel? Because the data is always going to be a proxy for how do you feel.
Yes, exactly. I also have the same philosophy. Because we might have so many data now, but we're not talking about computers. We're talking about human beings. And this rider didn't sleep well, or didn't feel well the night before, or had a fight with his girlfriend while at the camp. He just needs to be honest and discuss it with the coach. Because if the riders were just computers, we'll take all the data and we shouldn't need to do any training plans or any adjusting the training plans. We'll get the training plans for an automatic software, especially now with the AI technology, it would be really easy. And then we'll have the optimal training program for each one. Then we wouldn't need the coaches. But that's the job of the coach. We have to do with human beings. And we have to be very, very careful on what and how we prescribe the training to them.
When you look at amateur athletes, what I've seen in the last few years is because we're all time crunched, we're all balancing conflicting demands in our time. We've, family obligations, work obligations, and then we're trying to squeeze our training in. What we've seen is athletes who can train 10 hours a week, they've started to add more and more intensity into that 10 hours. So it's like almost every day is just packed full of intervals and cadence changes. How would you approach that kind of philosophy you have of zone 1, zone 2 being so important with an amateur athlete who is time crunched?
Nowadays that you can get the info so easily. Internet's full of training programs. The biggest mistake that the amateur athletes do is that they try to copy what the pros do, but they forget that the pros don't do anything except from training, eating and sleeping, while they have to do an 8-hour job in the morning and then have to go out for training. And they try to replicate the intervals that Pogacar, for example, is doing or Vingegaard is doing, while it's not possible. To me, it's really simple. If you are an amateur athlete, you have to devote most of your time on zone 1, zone 2, and then we can put some specific efforts just 2 times per week. That's enough for you. It's enough to bring you in a decent level. I have seen a lot of amateurs doing, as you described earlier on, intervals every day, every single day, quality work. It's going to bring you up to a certain level, but then you're going to struggle to hold it, and you're going to feel either overtrained, or you're going to feel the fatigue, or you will not be able to have any social life at all. In the end, you just finish your work, and then you will be just, after that, you will be just dead, laying on the sofa. That's my experience.
So I think that's maybe shift one that I've taken here is amateurs. We're setting up our training zones wrong, and we're not maximizing the adaptations because we don't strictly know what our zones are. We're approximating our zones. If we were to move on past that and kind of layer and build as we go, if you take an amateur who is like almost all of them time restricted in some sense, we'll take someone that's riding 10 to 12 hours a week. How do you think about intensity and distributing intensity across that 10 to 12 hours? Are you an advocate of like the Stephen Seiler method where it's like 80% easy, 20% hard? Or what does your head go to when you're thinking about that distribution?
Yes, I think a pretty robust approach when we moved back to the older days where it was more or less mainly endurance based. This has shifted in a direction what you have said, somehow called polarized approach, more in that direction. And I think this approach is pretty robust also for a good variety of riders, which we are talking about when we talk about amateur athletes as well. And so I think that would be a pretty good starting point working off, having a good amount of base work, but also being combined with some race-specific intensity work, especially focusing also when we talk about aerobic enhancements, also with the VO2 max training. And then in the lead up to the goal races, sharpening more with threshold work, and maybe if it's also some kind of more punchy race or criterium or whatever, then also with that kind of sprint specific work. That's for sure a good approach. I'm completely on that, and that is also an approach, a polarized training that is also applied in high performance sports and among different sports, but also in cycling very common to do it like that, because it's a good way to build up the aerobic system.
When we say 80-20, just to clarify on the 20%, are we talking about 20% of our total duration needs to be hard, or 20% of our sessions need to be hard?
That's a bit also, I think there is the understanding, you're right, is not always the same. As far as I would say, it's not that it needs to be on that point of 20%. Normally it's seen on the overall duration. So if you see all the trainings together, then the 20% would be the time to spend at the higher training zones. But it can be also 15-28, and it will be still a good training, or 5% up or down. I think that will not mainly change the impact. It's more about having the consistency and also the quality of the training, being able to stay in zones and not always trying to over push. Because also, for example, a VO2 max training can be either more or less an all-out training for some persons, where it is still a controlled training if you put it in the right borders of the training zone. So that's a bit the direction, I would say. Yeah.
So the 80-20, it shouldn't be taken too literally from reading between the lines from what you're saying. Like if we're in a sprint block and we're training 10 hours a week to make the maths easy, it seems pretty crazy to think I'm going to do 2 hours of sprints inside a full week. So it's quite dependent on what the primary stimulus is during that block, how strictly we adhere to it.
Yes, that's what I said. So if you break it down to a narrow block, then this is probably getting also super intense. So you have to see it more from an overall picture. And when these kind of overall metrics are derived for kind of a consensus on a training concept. It's more seen on, I would say, on a seasonal basis or training period basis. And then it's also incorporating all the training sessions. So, but if you break it down more to one training week, I would say it's I would always focus in one session on a main target as a really
like
important,
a primary adaptation.
Yes, exactly. Not to mix too much the different trainings in one session, because you think you might do good by adding more. The only time when this, I think, makes really sense if it's trainings that fit to each other. And also when it's, for example, a kind of simulation day where you might want to add up more fatigue to a rider in regards of having something like a race simulation, for example. Then it might make sense, for example, to start with threshold efforts and adding then a high intensity in the end, because you want to simulate a race in a training. But that's not the common training of a normal day. So normally you would either say, okay, this is a specific endurance training added by something that can be added, for example, short bursts of sprints, fat max intervals in it, or some tempo training can be related to it, some blocks of intervals on that. This, I think, makes really sense. But when you go more specific on the higher training zones, I would tend, especially for amateur athletes, to have this a dedicated training, and then also to shorten the training to really have the impact from that kind of stimulus that you want to have, in sense of mixing it up again with super long ride and then intervals in the beginning, middle, and the end. So I would more tend to the first approach.
So if we continue with this kind of layered analogy of building up, so we've determined a new way of setting zones. We figured out the distribution of intensity across kind of a macro block. For me, the next logical step in building this out feels like, what type of intensity do we introduce? Do we go with standard periodization, reverse periodization, or randomly allocated intensity based off our goal?
I think in general, there are always different ways to go on. I think there's not one standard way, but having a classical approach to have some kind of build up, and this can be also already polarized, then this makes, especially for an athlete who's lacking in some, on the one hand in time, that's one limitation factor, and on the other hand also needs to build his systems. I think it's good first to focus on the weak points, which is mostly, and there's the most benefit in, to start off working on the aerobic capacities. So with a zone 2 training, with the endurance blocks, but also for sure can be added already either during in a process or block-wise then in the process, the VO2 max work. There are different approaches in that. Some coaches might tend to say, okay, I don't want to incorporate VO2 max sessions in a traditional classical build-up. Some others say, okay, I want to incorporate it. My personal favor is to incorporate it continuously. So, and I do that also with high performance athletes that I really try to stimulate the VO2 max regularly, also in endurance training.
I can remember vividly a December training spin. I was on the back roads, there was fog, wet leaves, potholes everywhere. I was riding on a descent, one-handed, trying to stab this tiny little mode button and praying the battery would last until the final climb of the day. You know that anxiety, the is it going to die anxiety, it totally ruins your ride. And the truth is, for years that was normal. Every season I got into this repetitive cycle. I'd end up buying a new set of lights in the winter. Normally plastic lights, plastic brackets which would invariably snap, charging ports which would fail, and batteries that would fade. Most lights feel very disposable. They're shiny for the winter and then straight into the bin at the end of the winter, and we repeat again the following winter. That all changed when I got my first set of exposure lights. Suddenly this wasn't a consumable anymore. This was a piece of kit built to last a lifetime. That's why I'm absolutely buzzing about the fully updated exposure range. Reflex 2.0 automatically adjusts the brightness of your light. It dials it down when you're going at slower speeds on the climbs, and then it unleashes the full power of the lumens on the descent, so your hands stay where they need to be, on the bars, so you don't actually crash. There's another really cool feature. It's called reserve mode, and it kicks in when runtime hits 0. It drops to a low beam and you get another 30 minutes to get you out of trouble and get you home. USB-C charging is a total game changer to my mind. It means you can get now 70% faster charging, but importantly for me, you can top up your lights from a power bank mid-ride. So if you're doing an ultra, a bike packing trip, or you're going on an event like me at Badlands, just plug it into the power bank and away you go. No need to worry about batteries failing. Exposure isn't just another set of lights. This is the last set of lights you're ever going to need to buy. Go to exposurelights.com to check out their full range.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I know a lot of companies are starting to, and the links between top performers, it doesn't necessarily have to be sport. I've noticed a lot speaking on the podcast to people who are CEOs of big companies, and the amount of common traits they have with Valtteri Bottas, who drives an F1 car, with Greg LeMond, multiple Tour de France champion. High performance is a thread that links all these people together, and personality tests are definitely creeping into corporate world more and more.
Yeah. Like, someone says to me, oh, why do you, coach this age group athlete? And for me, sometimes an age group athlete is the easiest athlete to coach, especially if he runs a really high-end company. Like if I coach, there's a CFO that I coach, how he approaches work is how he approaches his training, and he's the easiest guy to coach. I ask him to do something, it's done. The feedback is there. It's bulletproof, and you kind of think, I wish that some of the professional athletes at Pro Conti or amateur or, World Tour level are as professional as what this guy does. So that when you speak to him is like, well, that's what my life is like. That's what I just transfer straight over to my training. So what you say is 100% correct.
And is that, let's maybe unpack that idea of professionalism. Like what makes him so professional? And is that a trait that you can see repeated among top performers? Is it the same reason Roglic is successful? Is it the same reason Vlasov is successful? What is that trait that we call professionalism?
I would say how I like to look at it, and it's also quite a wide road, but it is the attention to detail. It's a very structured attention to detail. Someone has asked me, oh, who's the most professional person you've ever worked with as an athlete? And I didn't personally coach him, but I worked with him closely. I landed up doing a lot of races with him and stuff when I was at UAE, and that was Alexander Kristoff. He was probably the most professional athlete I've ever seen. And yes, don't get me wrong, Tadej winning the Tour is super professional. Roglic has been incredible since he's come to Bora. But they all carry that same trait where, yes, they're fun and they laugh and they make good jokes and stuff like that. But when it comes to their trade, it is just super focused, super professional. Their attention to detail is incredible. And I just feel that is what makes them. Like you walk in their room and their bag is packed, it's clean, where you walk in some athletes' riders' rooms and it's like, mate, you've got to flush a toilet. It's like, so when you look at it that side, I do feel that then follows over into the actual racing on the bike.
I remember having a football manager back when I was a kid. I played football, I tried to make it as a pro. I got to kind of pro in Ireland, which is not really pro, about the level I got in cycling. Sure. And I had a football manager who fined me for having dirty boots one day. And I remember going home, 100%. I must have been 14 years old, and going home and just baffled at this, talking to my dad. I'm like the boots are going to get dirty. I'm going onto a dirty pitch. Why does he care if my boots are dirty starting the session? And my dad said to me, because how you do anything is how you do everything. I was like, that's correct. Such a beautiful turn of phrase, because it's so true.
Yeah, correct. Like even, with our lab here in Girona, you get people that come in with a good clean bike that we work on, and then you get guys that, it's like going to the dentist with peanut brittle in your mouth. You just don't do that. And I just feel that, if that's how you do this, it flows over into every other part of your life or what you do. Like going back to the ultra stuff, there was the one rider I work with, super professional, super successful, really wins races, podiums, like fantastic. And then he's like, at the end of the year, where I'm like, man, this was unbelievable. He says, like, what can we do to be like 2-3% better? And you sit there going like, I thought we could maybe let go of 2 or 3% and just have it a bit easier. But yet you see how that is, and it's everything from tire pressure to, do I need to eat this at that time? And it's just those small things that have a really big impact at the end. And how modern cycling is, especially at World Tour level now, it's changed so much over the last 4 years. And even now coming into the ultra side, and as you said, the gravel, which has also become a lot more professional, you need to apply your trade 100% so you can get a 90% reward almost nowadays. Like nowadays that, I've got the talent, I can get by, doesn't really cut it anymore.
The line is difficult, isn't it, for amateurs? And I struggle with this myself as well, because the nature of cycling, it sucks you in. And it's why every time I go out to Girona for 2 weeks, I'm like, I'm going to go out and I'm going to do a bit of balance of work and training. And then I'm like 200K deep into a ride out near France or something with a load of full-timers. I'm like, what am I doing? How have I got sucked back in this deep?
Yeah.
That's hard, because it's a sport that you can always give more to. I have a friend who's training for the moment for a Tracker for the 500 one or the 520 or whatever it is, and he's trying to win that at the moment. And I was chatting to him and he's like, I think I've done everything I can. I was like, you can always do more in cycling. Like, you're not in an altitude tent, you haven't done camps. It's like, at what point is that healthy balance for amateur athletes to say, I'm being professional and I've done enough, but I'm not running a, train without a driver through my whole personal life and my professional life?
It's actually a very good topic, that, because I have found lately that line is so thin and linear, where what I say to people is, what are you being paid to do? And they'll say, I'm being paid to be an accountant. And you're like, okay, but that's where your focus is. You're not paid to be a professional. So yes, they are 100% into it and they, dot the I's and cross the T's, but there's some of them that are doing more than what a full-time professional that's landing on the podium at Tracker is doing.
Yeah.
And that is where it's like too much has a negative effect. With those people, I sometimes say, do less. Like you are more intense than my most intense World Tour athlete. And that to me, I think just becomes like it works negatively. That line between, in performance now, that line between success and failure is so thin, where before it wasn't. And I just feel that the more that athlete does, that serious amateur athlete, and goes deeper into it because they possibly have the finances, the resources, they fully invested, they are clever and they have a brain, so they invested into it, has a negative effect. It's like, maybe do less, bring the fun back into it, and you'll actually have a better reward.